What exactly is evolution? Evolution means change through time. Hopefully, over the course of this presentation, your knowledge of evolution will evolve. Another definition of evolution, a very specific definition of biological evolution, is genetic change in a population of organisms through time. A group of individuals are interacting with each other, reproducing with each other, and that population changes through time. Now, I heard someone describe evolution as a baby grows into a child, that grows into a teenager, and that grows into an adult. That's not biological evolution. Evolution is genetic change in a population, a group of organisms through time. Another way to define evolution is descent with modification. That means that today's organisms came from previously existing organisms that were different. For example, today's birds came from previously existing dinosaurs. Some people also refer to evolution as the idea that life came from non-living chemicals on Earth about 4 or so billion years ago. That process is called abiogenesis. It's not exactly the same thing as evolution, but it's usually considered in the same context as evolution. Now, a little bit about the history of evolutionary ideas, and a good place to start is the person that is most famously associated with evolution, Charles Darwin. And he was born February 12th, 1809. Interestingly, that's the same day as Abraham Lincoln was born. He was born in England. His father was a doctor and a banker. His grandfather was also a doctor. And way before Charles Darwin was born, his grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, was talking about and writing about evolution. And Erasmus Darwin thought that all organisms have a single common ancestor. And humans and apes share a common ancestor. So the idea of evolution and organisms having common ancestors, that didn't start with Darwin. People were discussing that way before Darwin was ever born. And we'll see why Charles Darwin was so famous later. So Darwin's father was a doctor, his grandfather was a doctor. So of course Charles Darwin entered college and started studying medicine. He didn't like it. This was in the days before anesthetics. And one thing that he particularly didn't like is when children were being operated on without anesthetics and they were screaming in pain and yelling, and Charles Darwin was a bit squeamish about that. And he was a disappointment to his father. One thing that was written down later, I think it was Charles Darwin that was writing about it, his father said to him, "You're such a disappointment, you're not good for anything but rock collecting and rat catching," which is kind of what Charles Darwin liked to do. He liked to wander around the countryside and collect all sorts of organisms and observe nature, and he also liked collecting rocks. And there's a story about how Charles Darwin was collecting beetles. And he had a beetle in one hand and a beetle in a second hand. and he saw a third beetle he really wanted. So he thought about it for a moment, and he popped the beetle in one of his hands into his mouth. Unfortunately, and he grabbed the third beetle. Unfortunately, the one he popped into his mouth was a type of beetle called a bombardier beetle, and it's kind of like a stink bug. It produces really stinky chemicals that are very hot and corrosive. And you can see a picture of this beetle releasing its chemicals, and that beetle did horrible things inside of Darwin's mouth, and he wrote about it later. So Charles Darwin didn't want to study medicine anymore, so he chose to study theology. He was a young earth creationist. He believed, like most everybody else in England, that the earth was just a few thousand years old. It was created by the Christian God, and all living things were created through supernatural methods, and everything is now as it always has been. That was just accepted. He was interested in rocks and bug collecting and nature, like I described earlier, and that's what he wanted to do. And he thought that if he became a minister in a church, he just had to work on Sundays, and the other days of the week he can spend time doing what he really wanted to do. And he ended up getting a degree in theology. But while he was in college, he hung out with science professors and science students, and the science professors got to know him and his interests. And there's one botany professor that knew him and his interests, and this botany professor recommended that Darwin take a job on a ship that was going to sail around the world. And this ship was called the HMS Beagle, and its goal was to map the coast of South America from 1831 to 1836. And at that time, Charles Darwin was 22 years old, and he accepted the job. It was a good offer. And his main job aboard the ship was to be a naturalist. He was supposed to observe everything about nature, collect everything he could, write about it, take measurements from the ocean temperatures, things like that, just everything he could about nature. And one thing that helped him out, he came from a wealthy family. He was wealthy. He could hire guides to show him around the countryside when the ship made its ports of call, and he could spend days or weeks ashore exploring the countryside while the ship did its main job of mapping the coast of South America. And he made a lot of observations. And during his voyage, he was writing letters home, and he actually became a somewhat famous biologist because of those letters. And he traveled all around the world, went to a lot of places, and one place that had a really big influence on him was the Galapagos Islands. Now, we're used to seeing pictures of Charles Darwin on the left as an older man with bald head and gray fizzy beard, but this is what he looked like on the right when he went on his voyage. Actually, that looks a little bit older than 22 to 27. So he was a young man when he went on this voyage. And I mentioned that one place he stopped at was the Galapagos Islands. He spent some time there. And the top right, you can see South America. And the Galapagos Islands are 600 miles off the west coast of South America, off the west coast of Ecuador. So it's pretty isolated. It's very difficult for organisms to get from the continent of South America to the Galapagos Islands. And it's also very difficult to get from one island to the next for these animals, except maybe some seagoing birds. And it's made up of a number of volcanic islands. And this figure shows the route the HMS Beagle took. They mapped the islands of the Galapagos Islands, and Charles Darwin explored these islands quite a bit, and the letters he wrote home described these as horrible, dry places with really ugly looking, disgusting animals like giant lizards and giant tortoises, and he really wasn't a big fan of it. But he did make some collections. He collected a lot of organisms, and later when he was thinking about it, actually had a big influence on his ideas about natural selection. And while he's on his voyage, he made some observations. Perhaps his grandfather's ideas influenced him. I think that's pretty likely. He observed some fossils. In the mid-1700s, fossils were being discovered and described, and fossils are previously existing organisms that died a long time ago that are different than today's organisms. They kind of look like today's organisms, but they're different. And he saw some fossils himself while he was exploring. Around 1800, there was another biologist called Jean-Baptiste Lamarck who wrote about evolution. And one thing that Lamarck did that was different is he described how species evolved. So again, Charles Darwin wasn't the first one to describe evolution, and he wasn't even the first one to come up with an idea about how organisms evolve. As it turns out, Lamarck's ideas were wrong, but people were still writing and thinking about evolution. While he was in Brazil, on the other side of South America, he made some observations about some fossils. He saw fossils that were most similar to South American species that were existing today, but they were different. One example he talked about was fossils of a giant sloth. It was a sloth, but it was way, way bigger than today's sloths. It was much bigger than today's humans. So these fossils existed in the past that are different than what exists today. And that got him to thinking, well, maybe species aren't really fixed. Maybe they could change through time, because we see these things that exist in the past that don't exist today. He also observed organisms were very well adapted to their environments, but they weren't perfectly adapted. For example, in a number of places he visited, he observed that humans were importing animals like rats and goats and pigs, and these animals were spreading throughout the new environment they were introduced to, and they were decimating the native populations of animals. Well, if the native populations of animals were perfectly adapted to their environment, then they wouldn't be able to be replaced by these imported species. Organisms are well adapted, but not perfectly. And getting back to the Galapagos Islands, he observed that there were many unique species of organisms on these islands. For example, there were a number of species of seabirds called boobies, and some of them had blue feet. They're called blue-footed boobies. Some of them have red feet, red-footed boobies. There's another one that kind of has green feet. It's called a Nazca booby. And that name booby may have come from a Spanish word meaning clown, because these birds have rather goofy-looking mating dances. And also, maybe they got that name because they weren't used to humans at all, and the sailors could walk right up to them and catch them and eat them. And that was kind of clownish. He also noticed giant tortoises, huge tortoises, 5, 10 feet long, 3, 4 feet high, really huge. And he talked to the local governors and other residents of the islands, and they could tell which island that the tortoises came from just by looking at the shape of the shell. And these tortoises varied from island to island. He also noticed huge lizards called land iguanas. He thought they were really ugly. Marine iguanas are unique to the Galapagos Islands, and actually there are some on other nearby islands, but mostly the Galapagos Islands. And marine iguanas are really different. There aren't any other lizards that I'm aware of that swim and dive and eat algae. He also noticed a bunch of birds that had a lot of interesting adaptations. And when he got back to England, he showed these birds to an ornithologist, a bird specialist, and that ornithologist said all of these birds were finches. Turns out Charles Darwin was misidentifying them as other species, but they were all finches. And in a little bit, you'll see a picture of them with their different adaptations. And these finches occur nowhere else in the world. And a lot of these other organisms I mentioned earlier, nowhere else in the world. But there's a bit of a problem with that. These are young islands compared to the mainland of South America. They were created by volcanic eruptions. Geologically speaking, not too long ago, they didn't exist. And we know now that the oldest of the islands is about 3 or so million years old, and before that, those islands didn't exist. So volcanoes erupted, living things showed up on the islands, unique species showed up on the islands. Where did these unique species come from? It showed that God did not create all species at once, because these islands didn't exist not too long ago, and these new species showed up on new islands. Where did these unique species come from? What were the origin of these species? That started Charles Darwin thinking about how organisms weren't fixed, but they could change through time. And this figure shows Galapagos finches. Some of them, like a number of them on the left, have really huge, thick beaks that allowed them to feed on seeds. Some of them had thinner beaks that allowed them to feed on smaller seeds or insects. And in this greenish block on the bottom right, you'll see a finch holding a little twig. There's one called a woodpecker finch. And what it does is it pokes a hole with its beak into a cactus, perhaps. And it uses a cactus spine or twig as a tool to poke into that hole and dig out insects, grubs. And there's another group on the right that has even thinner beaks, that some of which, again, eat insects. So there are a wide variety of finches that are adapted to local conditions, and they're well adapted to what they eat. And they're different than any other finch that exists anywhere in the world. Where did these finches come from? That had an influence on Charles Darwin when he got back to England, started thinking about it, started correctly identifying these birds. Darwin also read a couple of books that had an influence. One of them was from a geologist, Charles Lyell. The book is called Principles of Geology. And Charles Lyell said the Earth is way older than 6,000 years old. And he talked about how mountains slowly rose over time, over the course of perhaps millions of years. And he also wrote about marine fossils on tops of mountains. What are these marine fossils doing on the tops of mountains? Well, perhaps millions of years ago, those mountains weren't as tall. They were under the ocean, and then over time they rose out of the ocean and got taller, and fossils of marine organisms were on these mountains. And another thing that Charles Lyell talked about was that today's forces of nature, like erosion, earthquakes, volcanism, mountains rising, are the same forces that acted on Earth millions of years ago. So what's happening today was also happening millions of years ago. It's a concept of science called uniformitarianism. Laws of nature, how nature behaves, is the same in the past pretty much as it is today. And these ideas had an influence on Charles Darwin. Another book that Charles Darwin read on his voyage was written by an economist by the name of Thomas Malthus. And he talked about humans and economy and supply and demand. And he commented that people reproduce too quickly. Reproductive rates are too high. Over time, populations will grow too big. And unless populations are kept small somehow, the populations will outgrow their resources. They'll outgrow the food that's available, their living space. And there will be competition for food, competition for living space. Bad things will happen when populations outgrow their resources. Bad things will happen to the economy. And he mentioned this will happen unless populations are kept small somehow. And in the case of humans, how are populations kept small? Well, what happens when people run out of food? They starve. More people die. Famine occurs. They fight wars over food and other resources. When populations are too high, diseases are more likely to spread through the population and kill a bunch more people. So there are mechanisms in nature that keep populations from getting too big. So basically, populations have a tendency to grow too quickly, and there are things that help limit population sizes. And this had an influence on Charles Darwin's later ideas about evolution. So he returned to England in the 1840s, just a few years after he got back. He married Emma Wedgwood. You ever hear of Wedgwood China? She came from a very wealthy family. And one thing that helped with him and other famous scientists like him from this age and sometime in the past, he was very, very wealthy. He really didn't have to work for a living. So he could spend a lot of free time thinking about evolution and doing experiments to confirm his ideas. The same is true of a lot of other scientists. They had money. They didn't have to work 12 hours a day to try to eke out a living. And they could spend their time thinking about science. Another interesting thing about Emma Wedgwood, she was Charles Darwin's cousin. And Charles Darwin and she had many children. And at one point, there was a teenage child that was lost. I think it was a daughter. I seem to recall she was 13 or so. And she died of a disease, and Charles Darwin's devastated. And he really felt bad that maybe it was his fault that she died because he married a cousin and maybe some inbreeding was going on, and that's why that daughter was unhealthy. Soon after he got back from his voyage, he came up with his ideas about evolution, about how populations evolved. But he didn't write about it immediately. He talked about it with his friends, wrote letters to his friends and his colleagues, but he didn't publish anything about it. Mostly because he knew it would be controversial. Everybody believed, most everybody anyway, believed at the time that God created living things just a few thousand years ago. Again, this is in Western Europe. And they believed in young earth creationism, and God created organisms using supernatural powers, and they are now as they always have been. Species didn't change. But Charles Darwin was working on ideas that species could change. Things were different in the past than they are now. And also, the earth is way, way older than just a few thousand years. So he knew that this would be a controversial idea when he published it. Also, his wife was really Christian and a young earth creationist, and he got into a lot of uncomfortable arguments with her. So, for years, he gathered evidence about natural selection. He worked with a lot of domestic animals and worked with artificial selection, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So he gathered lots and lots of evidence about his ideas, and his goal was to publish a huge 2-volume encyclopedia that would overwhelm everybody with lots and lots of evidence for his ideas. So he procrastinated for years, and his friends and colleagues were really encouraging him to publish. Then, in 1858, there was another biologist by the name of Alfred Russel Wallace. And he observed nature, came up with the same ideas that Charles Darwin did. And he heard about Charles Darwin and wrote him a letter and explained to Darwin, and came up with this idea about how species could change. And he described the ideas to Charles Darwin, and he said, I want to publish this at the next meeting of the Royal Academy of Sciences. And he and Charles Darwin sent representatives to the Royal Academy of Science meeting that year, and they presented their ideas about how living things can evolve. So Alfred Russel Wallace essentially forced Charles Darwin to go public with his ideas. Then, a year later, Charles Darwin published his most famous book about his ideas about how living things could change through time. We know it as The Origin of Species, but his book had a much longer name. And it's on the origin of species by means of natural selection or the preservation of favored races in the struggle for existence. And it was a really popular book. Many editions very quickly sold out, and people around the world became aware of his ideas. And most scientists immediately accepted it and thought it was really interesting. And Charles Darwin talked about how populations could evolve. He wasn't the first one to do this. He was one of the few people to talk about how populations evolve. Natural selection, he called it. But what made him most famous is that he provided lots and lots of evidence in his book on the origin of species that populations do evolve through natural selection. And that's why he's so famous. He said populations evolve, this is how, and here's my evidence to support my ideas. And then here's a picture of a cover of one of the editions of his book. One idea that Charles Darwin came up with or talked about was descent with modification. Today's organisms come from previously existing organisms that were different than today's organisms. He also talked a lot about adaptations. Adaptations are characteristics that help organisms survive better and reproduce better. And his most famous idea was natural selection. And basically, natural selection says that individuals are variable. Individuals in a population look different. They work different. These individuals produce many more offspring than can survive in nature. Some of these variations that we mentioned earlier are heritable. They can pass from one generation to the next. Some of these heritable variations give individuals an edge. It allows these individuals to leave behind healthier offspring or more offspring. And when an individual can leave behind healthier offspring or more offspring than their neighbors, that's an individual's fitness. So these variations, these characteristics, increased an organism's fitness. And these successful variations, these helpful variations, increased in frequency in the population over time. These beneficial variations were selected for. That's natural selection. And basically, another way to describe this in just a couple of words, this is differential reproduction. Some individuals are better at reproducing than their neighbors, and those individuals' characteristics are going to increase in frequency in the population. A few examples. In the 1940s, synthetic insecticides were invented. One of them was DDT that you may have heard about. And these synthetic insecticides did a great job at killing pest insects. They killed 99% of insects that were causing diseases and eating crops. They worked great. Then, by the 1950s, it was noticed some of these insecticides didn't work as well. They weren't killing as many pests as they used to. What happened? Well, what happened was DDT killed off 99% of all pest insects. But what about that other 1%? They had those successful variations that allowed them to be resistant to these insecticides. And those successful variations increased in frequency in the population, and populations became resistant to insecticides. And now, some insects are really resistant to many insecticides and are difficult to kill. Another example, kind of along the same lines, in the 1940s, one of the first antibiotics developed and used on a massive scale was penicillin. Penicillin did a great job at killing off bacteria. And it killed off, for example, 99% of all gonorrhea bacteria. This bacteria causes a sexually transmitted disease. It worked great for quite a few years. Then, in the 1950s, it was observed that penicillin wasn't working as well. There were populations of gonorrhea that weren't being killed by penicillin anymore. What happened? Well, again, gonorrhea, the bacteria are highly variable. They have different physiologies, they work different from each other, and some of them had mechanisms in their cells to deal with this penicillin. They weren't affected by the penicillin anymore. The population genetically changed through time. Those resistance characteristics were selected for. They increased in frequency in the population. Yet another example, you ever hear of MRSA or methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus? This is resistant to an antibiotic. This is a bacterium. Staphylococcus aureus is a bacterium that is resistant to the antibiotic methicillin. And you ever hear of a staph infection? That's what one thing this bacteria causes. Well, problem with this, these bacteria are often resistant to many different antibiotics at once. Sometimes it's really difficult to find an antibiotic that'll kill some of them. And what happened? In the past, a lot of antibiotics were used against these. The susceptible ones were killed off. The ones that had variations that allow them to leave behind more offspring. In the presence of antibiotics, those characteristics of resistance increased in frequency in the population. The bacteria became resistant to antibiotics. The population changed through time. Now, where are a lot of antibiotics used? Where are antibiotics used every day almost? In hospitals. This is a big problem in hospitals. Also, people that raise pigs use antibiotics routinely. They just give it to their pigs, not because the pigs are sick. They just give it to the pigs to prevent any potential infections. And as a result, MRSA is a problem in pigs, and then the farmers, the ranchers, they bring that MRSA back home with them. And now various medical organizations are trying to educate the farmers. Just use antibiotics when they're needed, not all the time. Similar to natural selection, Charles Darwin talked a lot about it, did some research with it, is artificial selection. And in artificial selection, humans choose which characteristics are the best. And humans decide which organism leaves behind more offspring than their neighbors. And can you think of any examples of living things that humans have really modified, either through intentional or unintentional selection methods? How about dogs? Think of all the varieties of dogs. Thousands of years ago, these dog varieties didn't exist. There were only wolves, more like tens of thousands of years ago. And then humans and wolves started interacting with each other, and humans started selecting characteristics in these wolves that they like, and later dogs that they like, and came up with many, many breeds. And we've actually created different species of dogs. A species is a group of organisms that cannot reproduce with similar groups in nature. And I challenge you to put a Great Dane and a Chihuahua together and have them reproduce. It can be done, but humans have to intervene. They won't do this on their own. And then here's a cute picture of how humans have affected natural selection, a product of evolution, a beautiful, majestic wolf, a product of intelligent design. Humans are using our intelligence to change these animals, to modify them. And there's a goofy looking pug that has a lot of health issues. Another thing that Charles Darwin wrote about, a variation of natural selection, is called sexual selection. And in sexual selection, sometimes what happens, the opposite sex chooses the best characteristics. Or perhaps same-sex individuals like males, usually it's males, will compete with each other, and the biggest, strongest male will keep away the smaller, weaker males, and they'll reproduce more. And this selection, in the context of sexual reproduction, leads to sexual dimorphism, where males and females look different from each other. Can you think of any examples of animals where males and females look different from each other? Around here, think of cardinals. The males are really beautiful red birds, and the females are more camouflage color, more cryptically colored, maybe with a little bit of red on them. And the females choose the best, prettiest red male to mate with. And that red characteristic is passed on to future generations. And essentially what he's communicating to her is that I'm healthy and I can waste a lot of this metabolic energy on these pretty red feathers. So I'm healthy. It would be best if for your offspring if you mate with me instead of this other male over here that's not quite as red. And same thing, think about peacocks. Male peacocks, they have these giant tail feathers that they fan out and display to females. And they also have other bright colors, and they have behaviors where they kind of walk around and shake their tail feathers at the females. And they're essentially advertising, again, I'm really healthy. I can waste all this metabolic energy on these gigantic tail feathers. And the female, who's more, again, cryptically colored, chooses the best, prettiest male. Another example, there are birds on tropical islands called birds of paradise. And again, the males have really, really different looks and behaviors than the females. And this shows a certain male bird of paradise displaying his very strange looking feathers and dancing around. And if you could hear the sound he's making, it's clicking noises, and he's displaying to the female. And the female chooses the best, prettiest male. And those characteristics increase in frequency in the population, and they go to extremes. And similarly, there's a little jumping spider called a peacock spider. It also occurs on tropical islands, And the males are brightly colored, and they will do dances and wave their legs around and display to the female. And these spiders, they're active hunters. They can have really, really good vision, and the female watches this dance and chooses the best, prettiest male that does the best dances. And males and females look different from each other, and the ones with these brightest characteristics and the best dances, those are the best variations that increases his fitness, and his genes are passed on to future generations, more so than other males who aren't quite as brightly colored.